Hello, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining this important topic and discussion. I'm Indu Saxena from the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. Today's topic is quite disturbing, I'm thinking that it should be hopeful for all of us while discussing this 1 year of Russia-Ukraine war and what are the conditions for truce and peace. And because we are focused on Indo-Pacific, so what are the implications for the Indo-Pacific mainly? On February 24 to 2022, when the war started, no one predicted that there will be stiff resistance from Ukraine and conflict will go long. Even I tweeted that it will be over in few days, in 5 days or 4 days. So, but I was completely wrong, and maybe many more. So, this 1 year of war reshaped the global politics, alliances, and geopolitics. And the spillover is felt worldwide, and the consequences reverberate globally. So today we are going to discuss that how this war could end or how this stalemate could be resolved. For today's discussion, we have distinguished panelists, and I am pretty sure that their insight will be productive for all who are attending this in real time or would watch the video later. Let me start introducing our panelists today with the Professor Yoshiro Sato. He is not live at this moment, but I recorded his session the last night, yesterday night, because it's too late in Japan. And he is a professor at Asia Pacific University, Beppu. And I just want to quote him here, what he told me when I was recording his session, that how this war changed the domestic debate in Japan in favor of those who wants to enhance the collective security with the first and foremost with the United States and the partners, the possible partners. And the spillover of this war is inevitably drug Japan into this, and the country must be ready. So I am quoting it from the Professor Sato, and now next we have Dr. Hayat Alvi. She is the Associate Professor at Naval War College, Providence, United States, and she's expert in national security and strategic studies, terrorism, conflict studies, South Asia, and Middle East Asia, MENA region. Thank you, Professor Alvi, for joining us. We have Professor Simon Reich. He is a professor in the Division of Global Affairs at the Department of Political Science at Rutgers University. He also holds an appointment at Chair Associate at the Center of International Studies at Science Po, and he's an expert on grant strategy and serves as the co-editor of the Oxford Studies in Grand Strategy book series. We have Professor Chintamani Mahapatra, who has joined us from Delhi, India. He is the founder honorary chairperson of Kalinga Institute of Indo-Pacific Studies. He was formerly pro-vice chancellor of Jawaharlal Nehru University and professor at the School of International Studies. We have Dr. Anis Kotoulas from the University of Athens, Greece. He is a faculty in geopolitics there and a visiting lecturer in Greek studies at Tbilisi University. And last but not least, we have Taras Prodyak, who's a researcher and a student and has a co-founder of a think tank in an organization, Adastra organization based in Kyiv. Thank you all for joining us. Before diving into the topic, let me do some housekeeping stuff here. Please mute yourself unless you are not speaking. We look forward to your questions, and please write your questions in the chat section. The views presented here are personal, should not be constituted to any organization and any affiliation. Thank you so much. And now I would like to move towards Professor Hayat Alvi. Dr. Alvi, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great honor and pleasure. And to be honest, I don't have a 10-minute presentation I prepared, but when it comes to Ukraine, I speak from the heart. And I was pleased to see this morning a headline that our Vice President Kamala Harris has talked about bringing charges of crimes against humanity against Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. I do genocide studies as well, so that's an expertise of mine. I do an annual conference on genocide studies, and my current book project is on Ukraine. So let me talk a little bit about the genocidal acts and intentions of Russia relative to Ukraine. And again, I was very happy to wake up to the headline of Vice President of the United States talking about crimes against humanity charges on the table to be charged against Russia, because Russia has done nothing less than that. And I'll try to connect everything to how it affects Indo-Pacific at the end of my talk. But not only has Russia blatantly committed crimes against humanity against the Ukrainian people, and that's very evident. Their targeting of civilians in residential areas, their very deliberate targeting of medical facilities, all of that accounts for absolutely no doubt about crimes against humanity against the Ukrainian people. And I also follow the Middle East very closely, and I know that since 2011, when the civil war in Syria broke out, that when the Russians entered Syria, the Syrian conflict, they did their practice run of how to exterminate people, how to prop up the Assad regime. And I will say on record that had Russia not gotten involved in Syria, the Assad regime would have fallen. So Russia came in and completely saved and rescued the Assad regime in Syria. There's an intricate matrix of relationships, geopolitical relationships, especially since Russia's involvement in the Syrian conflict, mainly to support the Assad regime, and that involves Iran. Hopefully I'll come full circle with the whole Russia-Iran relationship as well, and trust me, it has something to do with Indo-Pacific as well. But coming back to genocide studies and genocidal acts by Putin in Ukraine, first point I'm making is that he did his practice run in Syria. So his atrocities, his crimes against humanity, his partnership with the Assad regime in devastating the civilian population and practicing using new weapons and military tactics, all started with Syria and are using Ukraine as another area of utilizing those already practiced tactics. In terms of genocide also, what we have with Ukraine, let me just mention that when we use the term genocide, there are legal parameters and a list of criteria to define the term genocide and apply the term genocide to an actual event on the ground. And historically, we've had the Rwandan genocide, we've had, of course, the Holocaust, we've had the Armenian genocide. There's a long list of genocides historically. In my view, there's absolutely no doubt that what Putin is doing towards the Ukrainian people is genocide. It didn't start out that way. In the very beginning, a year ago, when it broke out, when he invaded Ukraine, it was not clear because we didn't know what kind of criteria he's meeting to meet the definition of genocide at that time. But as time went along, and some of the words that came out of Putin's mouth and some of the actions on the ground clearly indicate, without a doubt, that his intention, and intention is very big in genocidal acts, is to eradicate and erase the Ukrainian identity. So there's no doubt in my mind at this stage that that's what his intention is. And now he's talking about Moldova, and of course the other neighboring countries are very worried and concerned that they might be next as well. Poland, of course, is very worried. But his intention, Putin's intention, is without a doubt to erase the identity of the Ukrainian people. I don't know to what extent you have followed the reports of the kidnappings, the forced migration, the forced Russification of thousands and thousands of Ukrainian children and adults as well. That is very blatantly genocidal, because genocide is not just about killing, it's about erasing identity. And that's exactly what Russia is trying to do with the Ukrainian people. They want to force them to become Russian. And I'm going to put that in quotes, because Ukraine in reality is not Russia and it's not Russian. The Ukrainian people have their own identity and have had such for a very long time. And so Russia is doing a very blatant act in trying to erase the Ukrainian identity. And I'm, again, very pleased that the United States government is now considering those charges of crimes against humanity. To me, doing genocide studies and teaching that, when you try to erase a people's identity, it doesn't have to be through killing or mass murder, which they're already doing in the conflict against the Ukrainian people. But when they have a systematic act of forcibly removing people from Ukraine, especially children, to Russia, and giving children, Ukrainian children, to Russian couples, that's an act of genocide, because they're trying to erase the Ukrainian identity. Pardon me. All right, so how does this come full circle? Well, on the Indo-Pacific side, you have the United States trying very hard to create, pardon me, create a strong relationship and alliance with India, and we're having that discussion in my classrooms all the time. There's a big question mark about that, and we don't have time to go into that. But a lot of that has to do with countering China and China's Belt and Road Initiative and the String of Pearls strategy in the Indian Ocean. So that's one piece of the connection to going further east. And then China has a relationship with Russia, especially to counter the United States and Western powers, and possibly to undo the international liberal system of a rules-based order. So you got China and Russia, you got US trying to create an alliance with India, and then to counter China. And then when you have Russia and China, I wouldn't necessarily call that an alliance, but it's a friendship out of necessity because of the kind of common adversaries they might perceive to have in the West. And then the final thing I'll connect is that Russia supports Iran, as I mentioned in the very beginning, in many ways, including in the context of the JCPOA, which was the Iran nuclear program agreement with the Obama administration back in 2011, 2012. Well, Russia was a very active participant in that, and in fact agreed to enrich the uranium up to the limit of the JCPOA agreement. Now we hear reports that Iran has gone way beyond, and this is according to the IAEA inspections and reports, that Iran has gone way beyond the parameters and is getting close to nuclear status. We can see a similar dynamic, of course, further ahead in terms of progress with North Korea in the Indo-Pacific. But now the big question mark in that region is, will Japan consider going nuclear? Will South Korea consider going nuclear? And I can say, as a Middle East expert, that once Iran goes nuclear, for sure, I guarantee that the Saudis will go nuclear as well. So we have another piece of this, which is the nuclear proliferation part of this very disturbing set of developments and very intricate geopolitical relationships. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Alvi. These insightful remarks, starting with the identity crisis, say, for Ukrainian, and then the coziness of uh, Russia and China, and with the Iran, and then I hope that we will get the time to discuss the identity of Taiwanese and identity of Uyghur there in the Indo-Pacific when we relate to this with question and answer session. Thanks. Now, I would like to invite Professor Reich, Simon Reich, for his remarks. Professor Reich, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning to everybody, and I'm very pleased to join such a distinguished group and hear what you have to say from across the world. I'm going to try and address, as I believe it, two questions, right? So the first question concerns what are the options for the conclusion of the war? Where is it leading us to? And there's been lots of conjecture about this. And briefly stated, there are only four ways in which wars end, right? There are only four options. Option number one is with overriding victory, and the sort of historical analogy for that is, of course, World War II. Americans tend to think about wars ending that way, but of course, the reality is that you do. The second is through negotiated agreements. In the American case, post-Second World War, one can only really think of one war that's ended with a negotiated agreement, and that's Afghanistan. The rest have not. So it really is an outlier. The third is some form of informal truce, and that looks like the Korean War, right? There's a truce, but no peace agreement. And the fourth option is frozen conflict or abandonment. And we can think of abandonment, of course, in the case of Vietnam. Frozen conflicts, very few and far between. But the likelihood is that an agreement or a truce, the second or third options, are predicated on the willingness of both sides to make concessions in order to establish the status quo. Those are the only, in a sense, sustainable options. In the context of the Ukraine-Russian war, there is no evidence that either side is willing to reach that kind of an agreement. Indeed, parts of the Western alliance itself has made it fundamentally clear that the only option that they're thinking about is an overall victory, right? So we look at Poland, we look at the Baltic states, we look at the United Kingdom, and the only question becomes whether it's only overriding victory or it also entails Putin's removal. So along with the Ukrainians, the conclusion we can draw is that the idea of a negotiated agreement in which the Ukrainians are willing to concede ground is unlikely. Furthermore, both sides, for better or worse, see this as an existential conflict. They see it as one in which their fundamental survival is at stake. And of course, for us in the West, the notion that Russia is fighting for its fundamental survival is like an absurdity. But from the Russian perspective, at least from Putin's perspective, it's clear that he sees this as a civilizational conflict in which whatever he defines as Russian or Slav civilization is at stake. So that leaves us with a frozen conflict. And my assumption would be that what we are witnessing here is the beginning of a freezing. That is, neither side able to overcome the other, neither side able to establish a final victory. This is quickly regressing into trench warfare that assimilates more like World War I than what we have been told by military strategists for a long time would be the nature of a major conventional war, which would be high tech. And thus, we are likely, I believe, to see a frozen conflict as the most likely outcome, with no negotiated agreement, not even an impartial impartial or neutral kind of truce in effect, as in Korea, and that we are likely, therefore, to see a war which will carry on in name and in agreement for several years. Now, this leads us to, if this is the case, it leads us to essentially the second part of what I want to say, which is that we have three questions, and the first question is, what are the implications for Europe, given that it's the epicenter of the conflict? What are the implications within Europe? And what are the implications beyond Europe? Okay, which of course extends into the Indo-Pacific, crucially. Okay, so the first question, what are the implications for Europe? Well, clearly the war has reinforced the fact that there is not just a transatlantic security alliance, but that for security, the Europeans have to bandwagon on the United States. Notions about independent military capacity for Europe are somewhat fanciful. There has been a contention in the American press, restraint realists such as Steve Walt, suggesting that somehow or other, miraculously, this war proves that the Europeans can look after themselves. I don't want to criticize my colleagues, but I really do not understand that logic. What we know about the Europeans, what we've been observing, is that military budget in general in these countries are taking effect, but will come slowly. But even those increases in military budgets are extremely hard to offset in the short to medium term. That's for a variety of reasons. One is operation problem when you try and integrate military forces. PESCO is the major EU initiative trying to establish interoperability between military forces, and it's been very slow to get off the ground. Vast increases in military expenditures, such as the ones that the Germans have offered, the Zeitenwende, or turning point that the Germans refer to, largely, not surprisingly perhaps, leads to enormous inefficiencies and wastage when you're trying to re-budget in a hurry. The net effect is that you waste a lot of money. We also consistently see not just American materiel and aid being provided at about 50% or more of the total aid. But I read a wonderful story this week in which it discussed the fact that the Czechs have just sent $200 million worth of materiel to Ukraine. And that $200 million is then being paid back to them by the United States. So even when you read the figures about what the Europeans are providing, one has to be very careful because, in fact, that may be material and money that's being repaid to them by the Americans. It's an indirect payment. Okay. So talk of a European military capacity being prompted as a result of the war, certainly in the short to medium term, looks pretty fanciful. And the notion that the Europeans can defend themselves, that they're not reliant on the American security alliance, seems at the very least misdirected. Now, what has the war done not to Europe, but how has it affected Europe's position, right? it certainly, of course, ended the misconceptions that my European colleagues have labored under for a couple of decades, that Europe is, quote, a zone of peace, somehow impervious to this kind of conflict. As Indo pointed out, Dr. Indo pointed out, I spend a considerable amount of the year in Paris. And I have an association at Sciences Po, and I there in constant discussion with my European colleagues. And there has been a sort of complacency amongst Europeans regarding the impervious nature of war. Beyond that, this has exposed the fracture Europe. We are delighted solidarity we've seen amongst Europeans. The question is that solidarity likely to be sustained over time? And the evidence seems to suggest that we're moving towards some kind of impasse in the not too distant future. The first obvious question refers back to my first comment about whether total victory is possible, or to restate it, whether anything less than total victory is acceptable. And there the divisions are quite clear, right? You've got the Baltic states, the Poles and the British on one side pushing for total victory. You've got the Germans and the French talking about negotiated agreements. And that strikes me as a thin end of a large wedge grow over time. The second issue is what are acceptable levels of military expenditure. Increases within Europe, these increases are very uneven. And the question will become whether particular states beyond Poland, the UK, etc., are willing to sustain it. The Germans seem very uneven over the provision of materiel. They finally agreed to provide tanks. Now the debate is moving beyond tanks to moving to the question of aircraft. And it's quite clear that the Europeans are not willing to provide the materiel that would allow the Ukrainians to even contemplate total victory. So military expenditures are taking place. The Germans are increasing their expenditure, but then from time to time that they're being slow to do exactly what they have promised to do. Places like Luxembourg say, but we are so small. How can conflict? And so European strategic unanimity or cohesion is likely to be tested the longer the war goes on. And Putin is, of course, relying on that very fact. The final choice that the Europeans have, they face in the debate within Europe concerns, should the goal for the Europeans be strategic autonomy or to bandwagon in with the United States? People like Macron are very clear about the desire for European strategic autonomy, but as I've suggested, that's not conceivable. And what's really interesting is the notion that the Europeans are in a position, even in the long term, to build its own security, independent security community, free of the United States or NATO. There are areas in which strategic autonomy, there are areas in which the Europeans are moving towards strategic autonomy, which is the basis for a much larger project that I'm doing with Richard Higgett at VUB in Brussels. But those exist in areas of trade, the climate, democracy, even questions of human rights, far beyond the security parameters of the Ukraine war. The final question I mentioned was how the war affects beyond Europe, and I find this one quite fascinating. And of course, it does incorporate questions regarding the Indo-Pacific in general and particular countries in particular, right? First of all, it's so interesting to note that the West has not received the kind of universal support from, broadly stated, the global South that it anticipated, either in the form of support for its sanctions or for its UN votes condemning Russia. What explains this lack of consensus regarding Russian behavior, despite what Hayat pointed to in her presentation? It seems a little paradoxical. The answer is largely focused on what we'll call the long arm or the long arc of history. That is historical antipathy towards the United States and European nations driven by their past experiences and their legacy of imperialism, as many countries see it. In contrast, the Russian Empire never extended to places like Africa, so it's not surprising that Lavrov has visited 7 African countries on behalf of Russia in the last few months, touting the fact that the Russians were never imperialists like the Europeans. But married to that is not just a resentment, and I use the word very loosely here, so I apologize. We can argue about the word resentment, but a disquiet. Married to that is the notion of trust. The United States is quite often distrusted as a strategic partner. I have a doctoral student who's working on Indian US military relations at the moment, and she's conducting interviews with military officials, with bureaucrats, with politicians. And the issue that keeps coming up amongst her interviewees is, or the statement is, we cannot trust the Americans because in 50 years ago, they reneged on this agreement. 30 years ago, they reneged on this agreement. Whereas the Russians have always been trustworthy as partners. When you marry together resentment and distrust, it becomes a major problem. In the shorter term, the antipathy towards both the Europeans and the United States stems from the fact that there is a disquiet over the distribution of COVID vaccines. I remember reading a year or two ago in the midst of the crisis while I was sitting in New Jersey about to have my 2nd or 3rd inoculation, because I'm an old guy and so I qualified for all of these things quite early, looking at a map of the world in which when you put the cursor on a particular country, you looked at COVID rates, right? So as I looked across, for example, North Africa, I was looking at Algeria, 4% inoculation. And that was not inconsistent with the region as a whole. And I think that this distrust of the United States and the Europeans in general, married with this disquiet over the distribution of COVID vaccines more recently, has led to a general antipathy which is expressing itself in this regard. As I mentioned, in contrast, Russia has been seen as a reliable partner. But the consequence is interesting because we live, I would argue, in a world driven by diametrically opposing logics. The first logic is the logic of geopolitics, and that logic of geopolitics is largely pushing us towards a bifurcation of the world between blocs led by the United States and China. But that bifurcation should not be mistaken for the return of a Cold War environment. Why? Because the contradictory logic is a geoeconomic logic in which globalization, despite claims to the contrary, persists, and we argue will persist. So rather than bipolarity or even multipolarity, what we're witnessing is what Richard Higgett and I, in a recent piece in Global Policy, described as fuzzy bifurcation. And by fuzzy bifurcation, what we mean is that, yes, the world is bifurcating, but not into 2 consolidated blocks. And many countries in the Indo-Pacific and beyond understand the nature of that bifurcation, but at the same time also understand that it provides them with an environment to exercise far greater autonomy than they historically could, say, in a Cold War environment. The examples, of course, are plentiful. India expresses it most cogently. Jaishankar, the foreign minister, has become somewhat of a cult hero or celebrity on the basis of some of his outspoken comments in this regard. But we can see it today when military exercises are being carried out between China, Russia, and South Africa off the South African coast, in which South Africa, on one at the same time, touts American investment, touts Western investment, but at the same time pursues the military exercises with what are quickly becoming profound adversaries of the West. We see it in Saudi Arabia's refusal to pump more oil. We see it in a variety of statements made by global leaders, and we see it most profoundly in the fact that 35 African countries have chosen to regularly abstain. So how does this affect us? Well, in the context of the Indo-Pacific, we're left with a scenario in which the Europeans have repeatedly stated that they would like to play a greater role in the Indo-Pacific. We have seen occasional freedom of navigation operations carried out by the French, the Germans, as well, of course, of the British. But it is one in which it is unlikely that the Europeans are going to create some permanent and significant presence beyond the French defending their Polynesian islands, for example, simply because they don't have the resources to do so. So what am I left with in my last minute or so? In no sense do I assume that this war will end in the short term. We have been repeatedly told by strategists prior to the war that the next big conventional war between major powers would be. But what we know is that conventional wars usually take a long time when they involve proxy financial support. And this one involves significant proxy financial support for Ukraine. The Ukrainians are not going to give up. Like many countries before them, stretching from Afghanistan through history back to Iraq, back to Korea, back to Vietnam, we know that people, when attacked, who consider this an existential crisis, are not going to give up and go home. And the Ukrainians have demonstrated that kind of willingness to defend themselves very effectively. We were told that tanks had become finishing important in war prior to this war. Now we see that tanks are playing a central role in the prosecution of this war by both sides. And so what are the key ingredients we should be looking for moving forward? Well, very briefly, the seeming inexhaustible willingness of the Ukrainians to defend themselves, and whether that will persist or at some point they will decide that they're willing somewhat reluctantly or very reluctantly to play a role in a negotiation process. The parameters of the Russian capability to replenish their munitions, because apparently, given Putin's popularity within Russia, we are told, it is unlikely that internal support will diminish. Those people in this context who do not support him leave. They don't remonstrate from within. And so there's hardly likely to be any kind of internal problem. And if there is an internal problem, his leadership is only likely to be replaced by somebody who's even more prone to support the conflict from the right. And lastly, the vagaries of the American presidential system. Europeans are terrified that Trump or somebody that looks like Trump, a protege, a mentee, etc., will replace him, will be elected. which would signal a diminishment of support for the Ukrainian position. But if we see Biden or somebody that looks like Biden supporting him, then the likelihood is the Americans will continue to support. It's a rarity to have a bipartisan consensus in the American Congress. This is proving to be one of the very few areas in which Democrats and Republicans can agree. But we also know that the emergence of a Trump-style candidate, or I should say the Trump-style leadership, history suggests that the Republicans in Congress and the Senate are quickly cowed into different positions, and this could be an example of that. Okay, I've taken more than my 10 minutes. I apologize. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor, for your interesting and you gave the ingredients and the four ways how this war could end, and also the logic of geopolitics and geoeconomics, and with taking the concept of strategic autonomy and bandwagoning. I would like to invite now Professor Mahapatra. And basically, I am pretty sure that he is going to highlight the implications for the Indo-Pacific broadly here. Professor Mahapatra, over to you.
Thank you. Let me at the outset thank my heart, Dr. Indu for which is going to have its anniversary in a few days' time, 1 year completion. And this is a topic. I listened to my panelist earlier very carefully, and I'll definitely talk about the implications for Indo-Pacific going on in Ukraine. But just for a minute, to make it more lively and debate, I make one or two observations on what Professor Simon said about the trust factor between India and the US and the global South and all. I agree with that. But when we talk to the American side and the bureaucrats and the policymakers, we also find a tremendous amount of trust deficit on the side of the United States about India as well. However, in spite of all this trust deficit, over the years, we have been able to put in place a strategic partnership, which is not going to pay. Now, there are more Indian students studying in America than in Russia. There are more Indian investment in America than in Russia. There are more trade with America than with Russia. And if you see the type of weapons and the quantity of weapons, both in terms of cost as well as the materials, we are buying more from the US than from Russia. Of course, historically, Russia has supplied a lot of weapons, and the weapons gestation period is pretty long. So we can discern a shift, a fundamental shift in India's approach towards the United States. Similar thing can be said about the global South as well. True, the legacy of imperialism is not there in case of the Soviet Union, but the Soviets don't have money. And when the Americans were pumping in money, Africans were listening. And now the Chinese have lots of money, they're listening to the Chinese, but they don't have any trust in the Chinese, and it is coming up slowly. But the point he made so beautifully, so I thought I will just debate and see and say the other side of the story. Now, Dr. Alba Hayat, in her remarks talked about the nuclear dimension, Iran possibly going nuclear, and the North Korea. So in my presentation, when I talk about the implications for the Indo-Pacific, the war in Ukraine, let me say there are three impacts. It can be discussed in three different ways. Number one is the strategic impact, where we can talk about the nuclear issues. I'll not go into the details because the audience here, they're so familiar with the subject. In the bullet form, I'll just make the points. One is, because of the Ukraine war, particularly because of Putin brandishing his nuclear weapon and saying every other day that they have the nuclear weapons, there may be a nuclear war. This kind of statement has tremendous impact on the nuclear scenario in the Indo-Pacific. And there are many countries, small countries, which have the capacity to make nuclear weapons, but they have not done so for a variety of reasons. They are rethinking. Japan, South Korea, as Dr. Hayat pointed out, there is a debate going on. South Korean president went on record saying that if necessary, if the North Koreans push us beyond a point, South Korea may develop its own deterrence. Openly, he said that. Similar kind of debate is going on in Japan. The number of people debating this is microscopic, but Japan, while keeping silent on the nuclear issues, has made it very clear that they have increasingly entertaining doubt about the relevance of extended nuclear deterrence given by the Americans to both South Korea and Japan. So this is one impact. And many countries are saying that if Ukraine had one bomb, would Putin have dared to attack Ukraine? So if we have the capacity, why not make it? I mean, this is not at the official level, but at the strategic community level, this discussion is taking place. Number two is the economic impact. Now, this economic impact is across the Pacific, probably across the world. And of course, we all know that partly because of the pandemic and more so because of the Ukraine war now, there is inflation all over the world. And there is a threat of global recession in 2023. And the energy prices have skyrocketed. And there are shortages of food and fuel and fertilizer. Every country in the Indo-Pacific, including China and India, are affected economically because of the war in Ukraine. Then, of course, the political impact. In terms of political impact, there are many leaders now. They are raising the moral issue and the issue related to international law, and they're scared of violation of national sovereignty and territorial integrity. And most of them just call for dialogue to resolve the differences, and they're not able to be clear whom to support, whom to oppose, and all that. Recently, there was a Munich conference, and Professor Simon so beautifully explained to us about the dichotomies and the difficulties and the differences within the European Union and the NATO members on this. And of course, Macron made lots of statements, very powerful statements about negotiations, saying that Russia is, after all, in Europe. We cannot wish it away, and someday we have to negotiate. We have to help Ukraine to win the war, but negotiate with Putin to end the war. And I'll not go into the details on Europe because he has touched upon so many issues. But as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, I'm sure Professor Sato would have said many things, but very telegraphically, let me say that the predecessor of Prime Minister Kishida, Abe, tried to engage Russia very deeply to resolve the territorial dispute, and the ultimate goal would be to keep Moscow away from Beijing. But Abe is gone, and the war is going on, and Kishida is not able to follow up that policy anymore. It is all over. In the process, Japan has also imposed sanctions on individuals and entities and the Russian government. Now, in a way, Japanese have gone along with the US sanctions policy, but there are many people who think that in the process, Japan has lost leverage, whatever little leverage they had over Russia. And now Russia is most likely to be pushed closer towards China. Then Japan had a lot of investment, huge investment in the Russian Far East, and now nobody knows the future of that. Japan is also worried about the impact of the autocrats behaving the way Putin did, and whether it is going to be replicated in the Indo-Pacific. Particularly, Japanese are worried about the Taiwan issue, whether China will take a leaf out of the Putin's book and do the same thing in Taiwan. Now, Japan, a small island country surrounded by Russia, China, and North Korea, and that is why it is quite understandable when they're saying that whether there is ability of the extended deterrence, will the US protect Tokyo in exchange of New York, for example? Now, that is why the Japanese know very well the Americans are going to come very heavily on them if they talk about the nuclear bomb and all. But they have announced a new national security strategy and the new defense program guidelines. They have supplied weapons to Ukraine, something different in the Japanese defense and security policy. They have increased defense expenditure beyond 1% of GDP, almost double in coming few years. And their policy talks about developing counter-strike capability. And of course, they're improving defense ties with other partners like India, Australia, and Quad. As far as India is concerned, another major power in Asia, there are direct impact and the indirect impact. I have touched upon that. The direct impact is the Ukraine war has pushed our import bills for energy and fertilizers in a very big way. And in the process, there is inflation, and the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, is increasing the interest rate. So the interest rate is up and the growth rate is low. Now, with crude prices up, supply side bottlenecks, and the resultant inflation, our budget recently, which was placed in the parliament, it faced budgetary maths. And it was easy for the government to raise the prices of petrol and diesel, but it's not easy for the government to raise the prices of fertilizer. So the subsidies that the government gives has really gone up. And although many European countries, and at one time even the Americans were talking about Russia supplying oil to India at the discounted rate, that was, and India rose by more than 70% during the first 6 months of the war. And looked at India as a, however, we know very well and we make common cause that the real long-term challenge to both the United States and India, and Professor Simon very beautifully explained that, is actually China. The China challenge is the biggest challenge to both of us in the Indo-Pacific. Now, in some Indians, they argue that India can benefit from changes in the supply chains. And there are many companies manufacturing semiconductors and low-end manufacturing. They're now looking at India. And of course, the other people are saying that Russia and China are facing isolation of kind, and India may be able to draw more foreign investments. So the Ukraine war on India has both challenges and opportunities. Whether India will be able to take advantage of the opportunities, we have to see. A few implications on China. This is very interesting. Number one, please take note, China has not condemned the Russian aggression. China does not see Russian action as an invasion. And after all, Putin attended the Beijing Olympics on 4th of February, roughly about a little more than 2 weeks before he would start the war. And they issued a joint statement where they said that China-US relationship is without limit. The initial months of the war, China appeared, but the moment they the difficulties, slowly they trying to distance themselves. Now they realize it is my point of view. China probably realizes they cannot go too close to Russia, but they cannot maintain distance as well. And China actually blames the Western countries and the Russians' insecurity as the cause of the real war, and does not blame Putin. At the same time, China would not support Putin's nuclear stance. China would say, we are not supplying any weapons to Russia. And China also welcomes the fact that many developing countries did not condemn the Russian invasion. Putin and Xi are authoritarian. Taiwan and Ukraine are democracies under threat. Putin and Xi speak about ethnicity and blood relationship and historical connections, respectively, with Ukraine and Taiwan. But there is a little difference. So that is why many people think that maybe Taiwan is the next after Ukraine. But China considers Taiwan as part of China. And majority of countries in the international community do support one China policy. But in case of Ukraine, world does not support Putin's claim over Ukraine. The CIA director, William Burns, he says that China has learned very strict lessons from the Ukraine war, and he appears to be confident that it is not going to invade Taiwan. Biden has spoken so openly about defending Taiwan, unlike his predecessors. Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August in the midst of the Ukraine war. China was angry, it was fuming, it was enraged, it did lots of offensive exercises, but refrained from invading Taiwan. Biden is indirectly fighting Russians over Ukraine, not directly fighting the Russians. But still, thinking that there may be something going on in Taiwan, the Chinese are so openly saying someday they're going to use force if necessary. I think right now is building the military ability to restrain China on Taiwan. This is a direct impact of the war in Ukraine. While China is a nuclear weapon power, And the US may not directly fight for Taiwan. China is aware of the economic consequences as well. China is right now building the domestic supply chains, seeking to evolve mechanisms to face sanctions, if any, in the future, and the trade difficulties, and getting ready to face the American response to if they do something in Taiwan. For the European Union, however, as again Professor Simon so nicely talked about the differences within the European Union, Russia is a next door neighbor, and Taiwan is far off. So in case there is a Taiwan crisis flaring up, there may be transatlantic differences over Taiwan as well. In conclusion, I'll just say, make 2 points, one about China and India, a rough comparison, and a little bit about impact on ASEAN in a couple of minutes. Number one, both China and India have not criticized or China and India have not recognized Donetsk and Luhansk or Crimean independence. Both China and India have refrained from helping Russia militarily. Both have purchased energy resources from Russia. Both have supplied humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. Neither India nor China have very high trade and investment ties with either Ukraine or Russia. Both have been economically impacted due to the high energy bills. But there are subtle differences. Both China and India had good ties with Ukraine before the war was fine. But Xi Jinping has refused to speak to Zelensky directly. Prime Minister Xi Jinping more openly blames the Western countries, particularly the United States, for creating insecurity for Russia, which led to the Ukraine war. India does not do that. So, Indo-US strategic partnership will continue to be healthy, in my view, whereas US-China political ties are drifting apart. There may not be a Cold War. It is difficult because the mutual interdependence on trade investment issues are so deep between US and China. So I use the term cold confrontation between the superpower and the aspiring superpower. And that cold confrontation is showing up so openly everywhere. Finally, just 1 or 2 points. What was the impact on ASEAN? All of you know very well that even a country like Israel, Mexico, Egypt are not on the same, are not on board with the US policy on Ukraine. ASEAN has very deep ties with the United States. But 2 days after the Ukraine war, ASEAN foreign ministers issued a statement expressing concern, stressing the importance of national sovereignty and territorial integrity, but did not condemn Russian invasion. On 2nd of March, of course, many Southeast Asian countries voted in favor of the UN resolution condemning Russia, but still Laos and Vietnam did not. Singapore, a very small country, imposed sanctions on Russia. Indonesia criticized Russia, but Philippines, it had long military ties with the United States, and now the US is going back to some of the bases in the Philippines. At least publicly, it declared neutrality. Thailand and Malaysia decided to maintain studied silence. So, like the European Union, even in ASEAN, we don't have a single united voice on what's happening in Ukraine. I have many things to say, but I just touched upon its impact on Indo-Pacific. But during the Q&A, if we need to debate or discuss or learn from each other, we'll do that. Thank you very much, Dr. Indu Saxena, for giving me this opportunity yet again. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mahapatra. Your remarks, like starting from India and China, the implications for India and China and the ASEAN, like you covered up the whole Indo-Pacific, how this war impacted the Indo-Pacific region. And we will take more questions in after the discussion. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Ainias from the Athens, University of Athens, Greece. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Ainias.
Greetings, everybody from Athens, Greece. My analysis will focus on my double academic identity as a historian and geopolitical analyst. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not a kind of reaction to a supposed overextension of NATO. This is Russian propaganda because NATO does not expand. It is a coalition of free states. Other states enter NATO. The Russian imperialism against Ukraine is a macro-historical phenomenon. If we take as a historic landmark the Treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654, when, let's say, the polities of the Ukrainians became subject to Russian overlordship, we can see this historic attempt of Russia to subdue Ukrainian national identity to this notion of the pan-Russian tripartite identity. Russian propaganda promotes this notion that Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians, whom they call, little Russians, are part of a supranational identity. And this is essential in understanding the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, because these ideas are what motivate Putin's cycle. The plan of Russia with the invasion was to create a tripartite state union between Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. This would have an appeal to two ideological currents. First of all, to the people nostalgic of the Soviet Union, it would be a kind of revival, a mini revival of the European part of Soviet Union, without the Baltics, of course. And on the Slavophile current, the people that favored a union of East Slavic peoples, that is Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Russians. This would be like Solzhenitsyn. This would be also a kind of victory. These are the ideas that became dominant in Russia after 1991 and which were in work already before the collapse of the Soviet regime. Russia may be European in its cultural formation, but on a geopolitical level, Russia is not Europe. Russia is Eurasian, and that is the case ever since the Bolshevik regime, ever since it became Soviet Union. So Russia as a Eurasian power and as an external actor in relation to Europe. So this is the main question, whether Russia shall decide to reinvent itself historically, as it has done in the past, as a European state, but that of course means that Russia must leave all territory of Ukraine, and of course I mean Crimea as well, Georgia. Russia is the only state in the world, we should remember, that occupies the territory of 4 states. Ukraine, of course, Moldova, Georgia, and a part of, that could be disputed, of Japan. So Russia is not a normal nation state and does not act like one. The invasion of Ukraine was based, of course, on this false historical premise that the Ukrainians are part of this pan-Russian identity and they should be forcefully returned to this new Russian neo-imperialist scheme in Europe. On a geopolitical level, Russia sees Ukraine and Moldova as part of security belt toward Europe, and it wanted to create this active belt. And we should remember that Russia has done the same in the past. It has tried to extend towards Central Europe. It did that before World War II as Soviet Union and after World War II, both before and after World War II. And now Russia thought with the Americans leaving Afghanistan in a disorganized manner, this was perhaps the trigger that led to Russians finally deciding to invade, because, the concentration of Russian troops on the border began in February 2021. The initial gathering of the troops under the pretext of exercises began then. They took most of the troops in June 2021. So they wanted to test the West, how it would react. And then they began the great gathering again in November. So we have this attempt of Russia to recreate a post-imperial sphere of influence in its European. And the fact remains that the Russian power core is linked to its European part. Russia may be a great state, the biggest state in the world, but its power core is centered in Europe, in its European part. This is where it's a nexus of cities and of industrial power base stretching from St. Petersburg up to the Volga and the Ural region. I have a problem with my camera. Can you see me?
Yes, you can do with the audio one.
Okay. You can hear me because I have some problem with my. Okay,
sure.
Sorry about that. Now it's good. So on a historical level, Russia sees Ukraine this diminutive manner, and on a geopolitical level, it has this notion of Ukraine being its protected belt. What is essential about the future of the war, and I will continue with a relation to the Indo-Pacific region. How will the war unfold? I think that Ukraine shall win. I'm definitely certain that Ukraine shall win this war. Ukraine has invested too much, it has shed too much blood to accept any compromise. Ukrainians are not contemplating any compromise. The compromise before the war was that Ukraine would grant extended autonomy to the Donbas seceded regions. And perhaps in the worst case, it would accept that Crimea would be part of Russia. This would be a worst case scenario. And I don't know if, Russia had limited itself in invading the already seceded parts of the Donbas, I mean in February 2022, and Europe had abandoned Ukraine, perhaps Ukraine would be faced with very stark dilemmas. This did not happen. Russia chose the most extreme part, the most extreme path, that is full-scale invasion in the whole of Ukraine, and the attempt to incorporate Ukraine in this tripartite political union. Russia took the maximalist view, and this has turned against it because it woke the Europeans from their often unrealistic perception. And when I talk about Europeans, of course, Europe is not united. There are divisions. Eastern European states are far more realistic in addressing the dangers of Russian imperialism because they have lived under Russia as an imperialist power. The USSR was an imperial polity. And there is a mistake about some analysts make, like Mersheimer or Ward. They take for granted the Soviet Union sphere of influence. What I mean to say is that they take for granted that Eastern Europe that Russia has some special say in Eastern Europe. This is a mistake because the normative situation is 1991. It's not the Soviet Union. The normative situation is that each nation state has the right to decide its own future. Ukraine can decide if it wants to go with Russia or with the West. Ukraine has had periods of, ambivalence. It has tried to keep balance in the 1990s between Russia and the West. It even had some pro-Russian governments. But the people of Ukraine gradually approached the West more decisively after the Orange Revolution and after the Dignity Revolution, and they have decided that they want to be part of the European, not only security architecture, but political structure. So what is essential, and this is something that we cannot deny Ukrainians. Now, about the course of the war, as I told you, I believe that Ukraine shall win. I believe, I have a question from Mr. For Mr. Karim. I think that Russian military power has been discredited to a significant degree, because before the war, Russia appeared as this, very impressive military power. This was all a show to a degree, but not absolutely, because we have seen the malfunction of Russian military equipment on the field. We have seen how Ukraine, with superior Western technology at its disposal, has halted back, and not only that, Russian advances, but also liberated much of its territory. If the West decides to invest more militarily, and for the US, this is just peanuts. The US is giving 8% of their defense budget. They just gave this, and they have stopped Russia and Ukraine. Imagine if they gave more. For the US, it's a minor investment with no blood for their own, of course, using for their, they want to contain Russia. But of course, Ukraine is trying to fight for its very existence. The war is not existential for Russia because Russia can do without Ukraine. The only country for which the war is existential is Ukraine itself. There shall be no Ukraine if Ukraine stops to fight. Russia, it will continue to be. So what we shall see, I think that gradually Ukraine will liberate more territories. And the crucial point is, let's call it the point of a change of perception, of self-perception. What I mean by this? If you told a British official back in 1930 that you have to abandon India, or you have to disintegrate your empire, he would say you're crazy. Not only we don't have to do that, but we don't want to do that. I mean, the British or the Western or a French official about Indochina or Algeria. So the self-perception as a power of Great Britain back then and France was that these regions were essential for their image as a power on a global level. So they didn't think of granting the subject people's independence. In the same way, the self-perception of Russia today is that Ukraine is essential for their safety. So I think there shall be a turning point in Russian self-perception as a state when they shall realize that Ukraine is more of a problem for them, and they shall abandon their military invasion of Ukraine. This is very difficult to occur right now, but it will happen from the very same people that supported the invasion. It will happen from Russian nationalists, not pro-Western circles. This will happen by Russian nationalist circles who will say that it is, and there are some voices like that in Russia already, that it has been a mistake to invade a fellow Slavic country with which there are historic ties, of course. They have lived under Soviet Union. Back in the Soviet days, Russia was promoting this image of brotherly nations, etc., etc. So all this has failed, and this is a spectacular failure of Russian soft power. And just 2 days before the invasion, there was this Russian analyst that was saying that we do not have the soft power, so only military power we can project our influence. So to conclude, I think Russia will lose this war. I think it will reach this point of the change of self-perception. It will decide that it has to leave Ukraine because it can no longer sustain this war with the sanctions, and this will be a critical point for Russia in the international scene. And I think that perhaps there shall be a kind of agreement about Crimea, perhaps a demilitarized status or something like that, a transitory phase of 30 years. Of course, these are just educated guesses and hypotheses, but perhaps this is how the war shall unfold. And on the issue of Indo-Pacific, the consequences of the Indo-Pacific, there is a historic analogy. Back in the 19th century, the Western states defeated Russia in the Crimean War on soil of the Russian Empire in Ukraine. There was, with their superior military technology back then, you had the telegraph, you had the improvements in hygiene of the army. So what happened after the Russian defeat in the Crimean War in 1853, 1856? Russia reoriented itself towards Central Asia and towards China. This is when Russia grabbed the land of Amur. So I think that Russia will reorient itself after its defeat in Ukraine in Asia again. And this is very interesting because perhaps it will try to approach India more. And perhaps it will there shall be very interesting developments in this whole relation between India, China, and Russia. And this is something that we can see. Thank you. I think I'm just over the limit right now.
Thank you, Dr. Anis. That's like a very interesting your thoughts. You just mentioned that the annexed part, that how the annexation done by the Russia. Then you just talked about the Crimea too, but that's the whole controversy there in the geopolitics. Like if you talk about the annexation part, like someone who is winning the war and never saw that they are returning the annexed part when we talk about the China in Indo-Pacific or India-China war in 1962. So it's quite like very complex situation here at this moment in this Russia-Ukraine war, and how the war could end. That's the question that we started here, and you talked about the self-perception, and you gave the example from the Great Britain and all that French Empire. So it's interesting, and we will take the question in our QA session. Now, I would like to invite Taras, who is going to speak on the public opinion in the key or in the annexed part that we were talking about by Russia. Taras, to you. Over to you.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for invitation, having me there to show Ukraine point of view. My name is Taras. I am a co-founder of Ukrainian think tank Cadastra, with focus in international relations and foreign policy. I've got 2 BA, one in law and the second in international relations, Kyiv National University. And right now I'm studying in Oxford. I'm doing Master of Science in Politics Research. So the topics related to Ukraine, I'm a little bit biased in that topics because I'm Ukrainian and I feel emotional about that. But my probably main goal here in this discussion, not to persuade you think in my way, but to share the opinion how Ukrainians think. So I should probably also start with that I'm not an expert in Indo-Pacific region at all, but I will try to share my own experience on the war in Ukraine and possible implications on the global security system. So I want to start with this point. Ukraine war is not only a war about the independence of Ukraine. We should understand this war as the event that affects the security system of Europe. And as Professor Simon stated, there's even 3 questions. Yes, so what's the implications for the war for Europe, within Europe, and beyond Europe? So since our world is interconnected, globalized, and one actor of the war has a nuclear weapon, while speaking the security of Europe, we also include that this is also about the security of the world. So let's go down with the public opinion on the war. What Ukrainians think about the war. So right now, Ukrainians in the best socially mobilized shape ever. The majority of Ukrainians are expecting the end of this bloody war by the end of this year. This idea is not just our assumptions, not our aspirations, but this idea within Ukrainian society is based on the British intelligence report published that they stated that the outcome of the war is going to be this year. Our chief of intelligence office, Ukrainian, stated several times that 2023 is the key and final year of this war. But for sure, Ukrainians understand that there is a lot of unpredicted variables that can change the formula of ongoing process of the war. So Ukrainians basically are ready for any outcome. And I mean, not in terms of outcome, but about the ongoing process of the war. So we are ready for long-term conflict, but we expect to have, but we don't expect to have the war freeze for years. Even if you notice the Zelensky visit to Poland, while during the press conference, he stated that we don't have a decade or a few years for this war. We must finish this war in a short term. So we should realize that neither Ukraine nor Russia cannot afford to freeze the conflict or playing along, because war is an expensive thing, is an expensive phenomenon. I'm really happy that right now we, after the year of the war, we discussed the possible victory of Ukraine and how we can understand the victory of Ukraine, rather than on how Ukraine can survive from Russian pressure or how we can resist. So once I have mentioned the freezing conflict, it's also interesting to discuss how the freezing of the conflict will affect the other countries' interest in the war. So the interest of Ukraine is to survive, then to resist, and then to gain a victory. We fight for our independence. We fight for our possibility to live in a peaceful world, because we don't have any other place to live in this world. So how it will affect, I mean, freezing of the conflict will affect the Russian interest. I think there's a primary question: what's the Russian interest? It seems like even Russian authorities, they cannot understand the interest. We suppose that they publicly expressed their aims like denationalization, demilitarization, and the occupation. But basically, right now, Ukraine is the best ever has the best ever military shape. We have HIMARS, we have Patriots, we got Challengers, Leopards second edition, Abrams, and so on. So we get a real modern weapons to fight with versus Russians. And I saw that Ukraine right now is ranking the best 10 armies of the world. Secondly, Ukrainians have the most, I think, the highest level of the patriotic intentions ever. Right now, we started to realize who we are and what we want in this world. So I think that we should presume that the real aim of the so-called special military operation is to get control over Ukraine. Attack Ukraine, conquer it, install a government that is convenient for Moscow. But can they do it right now? Of course not. Taking the consideration of the recent British intelligence reports, they don't have a military capacity to do that. So even the more war will go and the more this war will last, the more anti-governmental, anti-Putin's intention within his elites will arise. And that's what Ukraine expects as well. And will it affect the Western interests? I mean, the Westerns, I imply the Europe and the US and our allies. So what's the Western interest? I think we can generalize it and say that West want to have Ukrainian victory and the defeating Russia. But it sounds so romantic, isn't it? So gaining the victory of Ukraine gives the security of the Europe, but defeating the Russia gives more, because will defeating Kremlin make Russia the militarized country? For sure. Because right now Russia spends a lot of their military equipment just on the war, and they cannot progress on it at all. Will defeating Russia will make it weak in terms of power and controlling some countries in Europe, especially with the democratic backsliding? For sure. Will defeat of Russia start the process of its denuclearization? Definitely. So Western interests will not change, but we should probably assume that the longer this war will last, the more they need to respond to their citizens, I mean governmental officials of these countries, and we might expect some changes in electoral preferences of some countries from left wing to right wing. And at least there is room for rise of populism within these countries. So I'll probably end with a brief commentary on the life of Ukrainians in occupied territories. It's not about the security, it's just about the domestic life, how Ukraine's life under the occupation. So right now, a big part of Ukrainian territory is under the occupation and repression. Some people from this region are forced into the collaborationism. Some of them are forced to join the Russian army, even because of the threats to the lives of their families and their kids. There are some cases about that. Most of youth in the first months of the war, they left these territories, and the rest people, there's a people in that territories who have nowhere to go. They left there. So people who stay there really live hard life, because unfortunately the parents of some friends of mine even told me that they cannot get in touch with them for a few months because of the poor connection. They don't have internet connection at all, and there's only one way how they can reach them is through the cellular connection, but it's really bad. So the most dire situation is in the regions where the military operations are taking place. These fearless people live every day under the fire and under the possibility to die every day, and this possibility is extremely high. But they stay there. They stay there because they have no any other place to go, because that's their homes, that's their places when they were born. So basically they live in a half destroyed houses because they have nothing left to lose. And they are no longer afraid of explosions of the Russian bombs. And this is very scary because it's not normal in the modern world that people are used to the bomb explosions. So I probably want to end on this probably negative note because of this war, because every day people die, and I think sometimes we should understand that and keep that in our mind, reflect on it, because it's very important for us, so we can make and we are able to make a balanced decisions in our life. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. We can understand the life and of the in the war occupied areas and apart beyond that. Thank you. And what Dr. Anis mentioned, that Ukraine shall win in this war, and because the spillover is felt widely globally, and everyone is impacted by this war. But I would just like to ask, because we are running out of time, if in the audience, if someone has a question, so please just go ahead and put their questions. I know there is one question. Hello, and thank you for joining this webinar, Professor Sato. I am talking to the Professor Sato, who is a professor and a senior professor and expert on Indo-Pacific at the Asia Pacific University, Beppu, Japan. And now I would like to know your comments on this, as we are talking about the 1 year of Russia-Ukraine war, and what are the conditions of truce and peace, and how this war has changed the global modern war, modern warfare, and how this. I also would like to know your comments that what are the implications to the Indo-Pacific, how the conflict in the Indo-Pacific has shaped after this Russian-Ukraine war. Professor Sato, over to you.
Okay. Let me answer the second question first, the implication on the Indo-Pacific, then go on to discuss the prospect of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I think the implication is that the countries like Japan have elevated the sense of vulnerability foreign invasion. And I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine was a reminder that Japan too is, a neighbor of Russia, and also there are other hostile states threatening Japan. Some with a territorial dispute, but like in the case of China, but in the case of North Korea has nuclear arsenals, and the conflict they raise not only directly against Japan, but also the conflict they might raise against some of their other disputants, like in the case of China against Taiwan, or in the case of North Korea against South Korea. The spillovers will inevitably drag Japan into the conflict, and the country must be ready. So this changed the domestic debate in Japan in favor of those who wanted to enhance collective security with the United States first and foremost, but also with other potential partners. So the various legislations since the late 1990s have incrementally pushed Japan into the direction of accepting a broader range of collective security. First with the US, but later with others joining this network of security partnerships, like the case of Australia and UK. Now Japan's also talking about possibility of upgrading the partnership with the Philippines as well. So those are the major development directly impacted by the ongoing war in Ukraine. And the prospect of the conflict, I think nobody really expected that the Ukraine would hold its ground this much for this long. And Russia has been facing surprisingly tough opposition from the Ukrainians. And I think the current stalemate between the two countries will likely to continue for a long period of time, as Russia doesn't have a capability short of using nuclear weapons to alter the current stalemate. And the West, the US and the NATO allies have no interest in directly joining the conflict, but they're willing to supply Ukraine with advanced weapons to stop Russia from further aggression. So this stalemate is likely to continue, and the one possible the game changer might be the domestic politics of Russia. If the anti-Putin forces, either within the oligarchy, or within the broader Russian populace, gain enough strength, or alternately, the Putin has been rumored to be ill, and if that's the actual case, maybe his health might become opportunity for Russian leaders to revise their current policy. So, but without those possible game changers, I think the chance is that the stalemate will continue for some time to come.
Okay, thank you, Professor Sato. Like it's a very interesting and insightful that this current stalemate will continue, and it's no one predicted that that Ukraine will hold its ground for so long. That and as you mentioned, and I just have one more question on this. How would you see that? NATO's role in the Indo-Pacific, while it's due to this war, like NATO is willing to operate or a kind of have a thinking towards the Indo-Pacific. Though we know that NATO, since its inception, is focused towards the not towards the Asia, but how do you see the NATO's role towards the Indo-Pacific?
I think that even before this current conflict, the NATO's interest in the security of the Indo-Pacific has gradually risen, and it didn't start with NATO collectively, but with individual members of NATO developing some interest. And I think various countries like UK and France and Netherlands and Germany, they have all shown their interest either through the publicized the doctrine and strategy or vision or whatever you want to call them, the various statements they issued, and each one has reflected their kind of national characters to some degree, but everybody is interested in preventing a major conflict in the Indo-Pacific, which might divert the attention of the United States away from Europe and into the Pacific region. So I think the conflict prevention is the foremost interest of European countries in the Indo-Pacific region.
Thank you, Professor Sato. Your remarks are very insightful, and thank you so much for your participation and your time.
Thank you.